Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the November episode of our Dóchas webinar and podcast series. My name is Katrina, and I'm the outreach worker at the Irish Support Agency, and I also sit on our mental health and wellbeing working group. So, before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that I'm hosting this webinar from the lands of the Gadigal people. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which we are all watching. We pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Dóchas will be brought to you on the first Monday of each month, which each session exploring a different aspect of health and wellbeing. All of our previous episodes can be found on the Irish Support Agency YouTube and Spotify channel. If you have any questions throughout the conversation, please feel free to pop them into the chat box. We will also take some time for your questions at the end. Tonight, we will be exploring the lifelong impact of unresolved trauma. We are delighted to be joined by psychotherapist Helen O'Byrne, who has a practice in Neutral Bay and works with clients from all walks of life. Helen has a deep understanding of how unresolved trauma can cast a long shadow over our lives. Helen will help us to understand what trauma actually looks like and what we can begin to do on our adult lives to address this and start to move forward. And we acknowledge that this is a difficult topic for people tonight, so we will have some resources throughout about support if this maybe raises anything for you. So let's jump right in. Helen, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thanks, Katrina. It's it's an honor to be here and to share this information that's really valuable and really helpful. And just echoing what you've said there, it is a subject that can activate. And I would say anyone that's tuning in now or listening at a later time, just if you do feel that there is an activation, I would suggest just, turning it off, go and do something that brings you comfort and then come back to it at a later stage. But there's lots of information, lots of resources. So I'm hoping that anyone who is really interested in the topic of unresolved trauma will find this helpful. Okay, so let me just start this screen here. So the long shadow, and I thought that was a lovely intro, Katrina, because it really is something that works at an unconscious level. And that word, a long shadow, is really, really apt in terms of understanding how it affects, our day-to-day life. So I thought I'd put a bit of a roadmap for the next hour because there's a lot of information and information is really important. I think I said to Una, I don't normally do slides. The last presentation for Dóchas, I didn't. But when we talk about trauma, as therapists and as a trauma therapist, the first thing we always want to do is give people resources. So there is a lot of information in this presentation, so people can actually come back to it at a later stage and they can actually do a little bit more research or get in contact with me if they're not clear. But a little bit of, I suppose, a roadmap that I have sort of kind of mapped out for the next hour is we're going to kind of delve into trauma. We're going to sort of look at what is trauma. We're going to define the different types of trauma. Then we're going to get a little bit of an understanding of how can we become traumatized? How is it that one person becomes traumatized and somebody else doesn't? Really, really importantly, we have to understand how trauma affects the brain and how trauma affects our bodies. So the physiology of trauma is a critical part of this conversation. And then we're able to move on to that subject of the long shadow, which is how does unresolved trauma show up in our daily life? I do want to touch a little bit on how traumatic memory differs from normal memory, because that's really helpful for people to be able to sort of distinguish what sort of big emotions they're having. And then we'll sort of come to the end and we'll have some guidelines to process trauma and some recommendations. As a trauma therapist, we are always looking at safety first, and paramount is safety. So we'll I'll give you some guidelines there for healing, and then some resources that people can take away with them. So let's start off with what is trauma. So I think this is really interesting in that the term trauma has different meanings depending on the context. And to quote one of the renowned trauma experts, Gabor Mate. I was listening to an interview he did recently, and he said that the word is taken out of context a lot of the time and used quite loosely. And I think that's very true. Sometimes people will have a really challenging day at work or a really challenging event coming up, and it'll be difficult and it'll be highly stressful. But the vernacular and the language that they will use, they will say, oh my God, I was so traumatized by that. That was really traumatic. That's not trauma. That was a highly stressful, you've had a highly stressful, yes, you've had a really difficult event, but it is not trauma. So I wanted to make that point that Gabor makes up front, because I think it's really critical to this conversation. So trauma originates from the Greek word, which means wound. That's the origin of it, which means wound. And I think that's a really great way for people to understand, because we have this understanding that in the medical community, for example, that, we all understand trauma care, right? If you have a really bad accident and you have, physical body wounds and lacerations and fractures, you've got to go into a trauma. You'll get a trauma care team come out and you will be looked after. So it's that wound. Behavioral health professionals, we define trauma, and it's a much more broader sort of definition as trauma is what results from an event or a series of events or a set of circumstances that an individual experiences that is physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening and has lasting adverse effects, that affect them, both mentally, physically, socially, emotionally, or their spiritual well-being. And that's a very broad definition of trauma. And if you Google trauma, that's the sort of definition that will come up. But for me, I really like to, a really simple definition that I like to give to my clients is for them to understand that trauma occurs when the event or the circumstances overwhelm your ability to cope. Overwhelm your ability to cope. It's just too overwhelming. So we're all built to sort of take in a level of stress, and a little bit of adaptive stress is okay. But when that is too much, when the response is just too much and it's too overwhelming, the physiological response, then that's what trauma is. So trauma is not the event itself. It's the pain that's experienced in the present. So the hurt's not in the past. It's in your body right now. It's in your nervous system right now. So that's a really, really critical point that, for people to understand, that it's not the event itself, because myself, yourself, and Una, the three of us could be out and we could witness the same traumatic event. We could witness the worst car crash or whatever the event is. And it's not to say that all three of us are going to walk away and be traumatized. Una might say, well, it was horrible, it was shocking, but her system is going to come back after a few weeks. Katrina, you might be the same, whereas I might walk away from that and be really traumatized. So it's subjective, but I love that explanation of it. It really is for people to understand that it's not the event, it's the experience of the event in the present. And that's what makes it so I think that's what makes it so difficult and so challenging, because it is that experience in the present that really impacts your day-to-day life. So when we work with trauma, we explore the past, like with titration a little bit, but we don't have to go really back into the trauma in great detail, but we explore the past to kind of gain an understanding of what's happening in terms of our emotional responses in the present. So that's, a good definition of trauma. And I love this particular slide, which one of my clients actually sent me when we were talking about trauma. How deep is the mud? It depends who you ask. And I think this point here, we all experience things differently. So that really is why the conversation around trauma and understanding, which I'll come to later, big T, big trauma, small trauma, is so important, because, we all have a similar biological system, but the response to it can be different per individual based on their passioning or their upbringing, etc. So That very much is sort of an overview on what trauma is. And I love this particular image and this from artist Raffaella Sentif. Trauma is not a thought. It's not about thought. Hypervigilance is not a thought. Startle is not a thought. Dissociation is not a thought. Triggers are not a thought. Freezing is not a thought. Shutting down is not a thought. These are automatic responses below the level of the thinking mind. And I put this in here for this presentation this evening because for many, many, many years, if I'm going back 20, 25 years, when we worked with trauma and in trauma therapy, it was all about, it was all about the top-down approach, all about working with the mind. But with all of the research in the last sort of decade, and for, with people like Peter Levine and Basil van der Kolk and Deb Dana, we really have started to understand that trauma on a very different level, that it is the mind, but it is also about a very strong response in the body. So I think that's a very powerful, slide there for people to understand that the responses that they have come from the autonomic nervous system. Is that clear? Am I kind of making sense so far? Is there anything you want to stop me or ask? And stop me at any time, Katrina, if there's anything that I'm not clear or if you've got any questions on. No. So let's sort of, sorry, did I?
No, I just was going to say you've already given us a fantastic overview in the first 15 minutes. So you keep going because I love this big T and we're really getting into it now.
Yeah. So to define trauma, and as I said, there's lots of definitions and clinicians will use different definitions depending on the work that they do. So I've just tried to, for the purpose of this evening, really just sort of categorize them in a way that, people can actually sort of relate to and see what sort of resonates. But the first type of trauma, and I've just called it type 1, is acute trauma. So that's that unexpected single incident. And that's often classified by practitioners as big T. So something like that might be war, it might be a terrorist attack, it might be a plane crash. It's the things that we all kind of know, or a car accident. If we're having conversations with each other, we know, oh my God, that's trauma. That would be very traumatizing. And we call that acute trauma, or some people call it shock trauma. The second type is complex trauma, which involves, it's more of a repetitive trauma. It involves experience during one's upbringing. And then we have chronic trauma, and chronic trauma is the experiences that people have they may have multiple experiences that make the trauma quite complex. So it'd be adverse reactions to multiple different types of events. So they're just sort of, I've classified them there. They're the three main types that we are sort of working with. But we also have systemic trauma, which results from long-term distress in the context of harmful systems. We've got trauma from poverty. We've got trauma from racism. We've got intergenerational trauma. We've got vicarious trauma that a lot of paramedics or, people who are on the front line or helping people would experience. We've got attachment trauma. We've got betrayal trauma, grief trauma. So you can see the list is really huge. And we could spend an hour talking on grief trauma as a webinar, or an hour talking about attachment trauma. So what I'm trying to get across here is that it's really, really far-reaching, across multiple kind of areas. What I wanted to kind of tap into was small trauma, what we call small t, which is a definition I personally hate as a therapist, and I know a lot of other therapists do, but it is how we've tend to classify trauma as big T and small t trauma. And for me, I don't particularly like the wording of it, because I think small t sort of almost infers that it's not as, devastating as big T would be, which is certainly not the case. So this slide I love, because we can kind of have a look here at what we define as big T. And I must say the reason that these are defined as such a way by clinicians is in order to apply the right treatment. So it's more about the treatment and a classification. But when we look at them, big T is really what I've said, that acute shock. So it's everything society views as trauma, war, terrorist attack, a plane crash, car crash, etc. Look at the symptoms that we have from that. So it's catastrophic events, life-threatening, really distressing to the nervous system. The sort of feelings that it evokes is, feelings of being powerless, despair, helplessness. It's commonly used by, therapists to diagnose PTSD or complex PTSD, CPTSD as we call it. And you sort of have a behavior of active avoidance, avoiding places, avoiding triggers. On the right-hand side, when we look at small trauma, that can include things like neglect. So rejection, abandonment, bullying, parental indifference, divorce, financial stress, even things like even moving or, separation. There's lots of things we can put under what we coin as small t. What is really interesting is when you look at the symptoms that they're equally as devastating. We have catastrophic, life-altering and distressing to the nervous system. Evokes feelings of powerless, low self-esteem, low self-worth, evokes feelings of shame. They're often overlooked and minimized. And where we have that active avoidance with big T, we tend to have this passive avoidance. And I've seen this with clients that I've worked with. They've kind of gone, oh, I shouldn't be, it's not as big as that. There's almost sometimes this almost self kind of, well, I shouldn't feel this because it wasn't a plane crash, or I shouldn't feel this because it wasn't this. But these, with the research in trauma over the last 20 years, especially the last decade, what they discovered, and if you think back to, when we had veterans coming back and people who'd come back from war, and we were kind of saying, well, let's talk about it, but talking about it wasn't, enough. Then they started to do the brain scans, and they started to realize that people who had experienced trauma, the imprint of that had been actually, could actually be seen in their brain. And interestingly, people who had, experienced childhood neglect also had the same imprint in their brain. So really what we're saying here is, I think it's important for people to realize the impact, things that they may not necessarily consider to be trauma, that they are trauma, and to understand that. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, because I think something that we always hear is, it could be worse, or my situation isn't as bad as, and it's actually quite harmful for even us, maybe as a friend, if we're hearing something to say it could be worse. So, we should not minimize these small things. Yeah.
Absolutely, Katrina, absolutely. So here is a slide that I've just put in, and I love this, slide on the right, and really saying that people, who were raised with love, they see things different than those who were raised, on fear. And that's a really powerful slide, because when we're meeting people in our day-to-day life, we're sort of, if we're coming from a secure attachment, we're often assuming that other people are. But people will navigate life through the lens, if they weren't raised with love, if they weren't raised in a secure environment, the lens and how they navigate, the cues and how they navigate the world is going to be very different. We're going to look at, so childhood trauma as probably, and I put this in here, and I know you had questions on it, Katrina, but it's, when I think of when is the time in your life that you're most vulnerable, when is the time that you are most kind of vulnerable to being traumatized, I think it really is in childhood. And things that can trigger childhood trauma, sometimes people don't sort of realize, what that sort of list is. So I've sort of put in here a couple of things. People often will come into therapy and they'll say, oh, Helen, they'll know that their childhood wasn't ideal, but they won't realize how detrimental it actually was, or that they're having a trauma response to it in adulthood. So I thought it would be helpful to list some of these things that people can experience. So common causes of childhood trauma. So taking adult responsibilities at a young age. So somebody who's been given, not really allowed to enjoy their childhood, and they've been given that sort of responsibility well beyond their capability of actually stepping into it. Unpredictable caregivers, caregivers that are, warm 1 minute and then the next day they're hostile or they're angry. All of that sort of mixed messaging is what we call attachment trauma, which again is another, that's a huge subject matter, but it really has a huge impact on how an individual forms relationships throughout their life. If they learn at a very young age that their one caregiver, is going to be that there's that they're unpredictable in terms of whether they're going to show love or take it away or be angry or whatever their emotion's going to be. Absolutely, caregivers with substance issues, or caregivers who have mental health issues has a huge impact on a child. A child, that's experiencing, verbal, physical, sexual or emotional abuse. Neglect, emotional neglect, witnessing violence, getting bullied. Scary medical procedures is another one that can really traumatize and really have a lasting impact. And other things which I put there at the end, sibling favoritism. If you grow up in a home and, there is that sibling favoritism, or divorce. And I'm not saying that all divorce, some people divorce and they manage to do it with emotional, putting the needs of their children first, and the children don't. I'm not saying that every divorce ends with a traumatized child. It absolutely doesn't. But if the emotional needs of the child are not really taken into consideration, it can create trauma. Being made fun of is another one that, being made fun of at a family event consistently, or being shamed. So all of these things are causes, and there's many more. These are just some that I've put up, but I think it is important just at that point to really see that not everybody, their experience of childhood may not have been, what we sort of, the ideal, where it's a beautiful world and you're cared and you're nurtured by your caregivers, and that does have an impact. So it has an impact, and I've just kind of caused it the invisible wound of emotional neglect in childhood, because it is an invisible wound. Because really, in the absence of that positive attunement, children learn that their basic needs don't matter. And that really, that is a really, really deep attachment trauma wound, when you learn that, your basic needs don't matter. The emotional neglect, I've said here, it's about what your caregivers did not do for you. It's what they did not do for you. And, a lot of those symptoms don't really come up until that you've actually experienced harm, until much later on in your life. Because when you're a child, you are with your caregivers, you are doing your best to survive. If your caregivers, as I've mentioned, are emotionally, that neglect, if you're not being listened to, if your opinion doesn't matter, if you're being belittled, if you can't have a voice, if you're being criticized all of the time, that neglect is internalized, and a part of you will be born that will kind of have a belief system of, I don't matter, or there's something wrong with me, or I'm worthless, or I'm not lovable, or everyone will leave me. And, if you're not trusting, nobody can be trusted. There's no one that's really going to take care of me. So, I think it's really, really, it's destructive. And I've said here, the coping mechanisms or the coping strategies for those painful beliefs, people tend to either suppress their emotions, and we see that later on in adulthood, or they transform them into acceptable ones, like anger or anxiety, because they're kind of acceptable emotions that we can kind of use as an outlay. But it's particularly, I think, emotional neglect. It really has, I think that, to me as a therapist, is when people come in, as you said there, Katrina, and they'll say, I don't know if this is a really big deal, but, you know, this happened when I was younger and, you know, I was never heard, or they don't, you know, kind of, they don't necessarily equate that why they feel that kind of deep sadness or deep wound. And I put down dissociation because dissociation is a survival mechanism. When you can't escape, especially as a child, when you're there, the people who are supposed to really care and nurture and look after you and be attuned to you, and when you fall over, they pick you up and they look after you. When you can't escape, you know, your caregivers, that sort of betrayal trauma, that's when I think dissociation, it's a survival mechanism. And that's where we see a lot of that later on in adulthood, in unresolved trauma, where, you know, that's the brain's way of saying, you know, this is too much. This reality is too much. And it's a clever way that our body actually, our body works. I mean, I always look at dissociation on a spectrum, because we all do it at times. We do it from the very beginning of, you know, even daydreaming. And then we may do it, you know, I'm sure if you've ever been driving, Katrina, and you're driving off a highway and you miss a couple of exits and you think, oh, good God, where was I? How did I even drive past this? So we all dissociate a little bit, but people who have a real trauma response, they will be dissociating you know, from that mechanism they've learned. And it's not helpful in adulthood because, you know, you may say to them, they'll say, I've had a huge row with my partner this weekend. What was it about? And they can't even tell you because they've dissociated. So then it's very hard then to learn from those experiences. But, you know, I think the emotional neglect in childhood, yeah, it really is that invisible trauma. So important that we sort of, include that in the overall conversation on unresolved trauma.
And that's dissociation, Helen. That's something that I've heard before when doing intake for our counselling service was, I don't really know what's happened, but I can't remember my childhood, or there's large parts where there's not a lot of information there. And that's obviously their response to keep them safe for such a time.
Yes, absolutely. It really is. And it's a protective, and you do hear that a lot. You know, people will, they'll have huge blocks of memory, and it's a survival, you know, so it's helpful in childhood, but a problem as we go into adulthood. I've put here some of the childhood trauma responses, which we call the 4 Fs, really just so people can get an understanding of, you know, if you grow up in a home that's chaos and, you know, you're constantly then looking for danger, or you're not getting that love, your autonomic nervous system is constantly checking out your environment to see, you know, you're checking verbal and non-verbal cues to help you determine, is there danger about, am I safe, which leads to this dysregulation. But the 4 Fs, as we call them, of the responses that you tend to get are the fight, the flight, the freeze, and the fawn, which a lot of people are familiar with. But how they sort of, I suppose, how those symptoms sort of look like later on in life is that kind of fight response. You know, people can be very impulsive, they can be explosive, they can be manipulative, they can be very controlling, because it is that, wow, there's danger around, what am I going to do? They bring on those fight defenses. The flight we often see as people who are workaholics, overthinking, a lot of anxiety, or absolute perfectionists. That freeze response is, you know, it plays out in symptoms where people are indecisive. They almost are kind of, you know, that paralysis, and they're, you know, absolutely numb. They have what we're talking about, that dissociation. And the fawn response that we often see from that childhood trauma response in adults is that people pleasing. And when you think about it, you think, you know, well, if I please everybody, you know, if I have a belief system that I'm not lovable, you know, if I please everybody and I do everything everyone says, well, then maybe I will be loved. We tend to see absolutely a lack of boundaries and a lot of codependency. So, you know, that's just for us to look at how developmental trauma really affects, and it really affects the brain, right? It really affects our responses to how we perceive danger. And that's something that if we have at a very, very early age, it's with us until we can actually really bring our attention to it and realize that, you know, maybe in this present moment, we don't need to feel like this, or we don't need to have these responses. Okay. So I've just put that slide in there from the holistic psychologist, which I love because I think it's a great overview of just looking at, in terms of brain development, what we have on the, based on my right and left, my right here, the typical development of a brain, and then we've got developmental trauma, so when it happens at an early age. And the thing that you notice straight away is the survival. So really, on a typical development, if you don't grow up in that way, if your early years are not that way, if your needs are attuned to, and your caregivers you know, are there when you fall, and there when you've got issues, and there when you've got problems, and you're really looked after and your nervous system is soothed. You've got survival, regulation, social, emotional, and then cognition. Whereas with developmental trauma, we can see that, you know, it's completely the opposite. So survival is really, in terms of our development, is the absolute. And the brain soul, I mean, the sole reason, you know, I suppose function of our brain is to ensure our survival. But, you know, definitely if you have grown up with that early childhood trauma, it is going to change how your brain perceives danger. So are we good? Am I making sense?
A lot of sense.
Yes.
I'm just looking here. We often would hear when someone's got a trauma response that they're dysregulated, and that means that they would just go into survival mode for that period of however long that would last.
Yes, absolutely. And that is the survival mode mechanism. I've put here, you know, just a slide here, just with the different, go back up, sorry. The processes that we have. And I think the key part on this particular slide is for people to understand that during a traumatic event, the brain is, as I said, primed to ensure survival. I mean, that's its absolute, you know, key, you know, task is to ensure survival. And at the same time, it's that line of defense that actually keeps us then trapped in the cycle of the traumatic memory. Because, you know, our brains that's how we've kind of wired sort of our brain to be always on the lookout for that threat or that defense. So I said here, to heal from trauma, we have to understand what's happening in the traumatized brain while the traumatic event is occurring, as well as how we get held hostage to the threat and the cues long after it's passed. So we can't work with trauma without understanding the imprint it leaves in our brain and renders our ability to problem solve. And I put that in there because I think for a lot of people, they're almost scared of the response, and they don't really, they're thinking, oh my goodness, what's wrong with me, or why can't I reframe my thinking, or why can't I move on, without really realizing that the imprint of this has actually changed something in the brain. And I will say here that the brain is malleable. We've got neuroplasticity, so we can change and we can rewire the brain, but we first have to recognize, okay, this has really cued my brain to be on that alert all of the time for danger. And how that plays out in different situations to somebody whose brain isn't cued like that is they're going to perceive threat maybe when, you know, there really isn't any threat there. Okay, so here I have put in this slide the neurobiology, and there's so much information that you can research, especially with Bessel van der Kolk's work or Peter Levine's work or Deb Dana's work. But if you just look here on the three main parts of the brain, we have our prefrontal cortex. And our prefrontal cortex is really responsible for our thinking and our sort of rational responses. The prefrontal cortex tends to go offline when we we endure trauma or we have a very traumatic event. It also goes offline when we drink an awful lot, which is why people often don't make very good decisions, or when we're under high stress. Really, sometimes if you're just so stressed, and I know for me, even coming on tonight, I've logged into my laptop a million times. I could not remember my password. And I thought, oh my God, what is my password? Because that thinking part of my brain seemed to have just evaporated. We have the hippocampus, which is really where our memories are stored. And then we have the amygdala. So when we understand what's happening in the brain, so when we have a disturbing event or we have a threat, the brain will activate, the amygdala here, which is at the base of the brain, will literally respond by sending out. It's almost like an alarm system, like there is a threat, there is danger, there is a threat. So the amygdala activates then the sympathetic nervous system, which is going to release your adrenaline and your noradrenaline and all of your stress hormones. And then the hippocampus is going to be, the hippocampus is, the hippocampus actually shrinks if there is if you have ongoing trauma. So things like short-term fear or anxiety, or, if you're in danger or if you're really, really anxious, that's okay. But if you're having that sort of negative impact over and over and over and over again, the amygdala is just going to be constantly sending out this sort of like a warning signal that there is a threat. And this then is going to be activating all the time. We have the messaging. That's the thing. It's not just the brain. That is going to be then telling your autonomic nervous system that you're in danger, that there's going to be a threat, and the body will be going into fight or flight or whatever one of the nervous system states, which I'll come on to. So I think, it's important to understand that it is a survival response in the brain, and that really the hippocampus really has shrunk. And then that really then hinges your ability to be able to really process. So lots of information that people can sort of research on neurobiology, which I'd really recommend. But what I've put here in a more simple way than going into all of the science on it is to kind of look at, okay, what does our brain look like and how does it sort of function when we haven't experienced trauma? And then what does our brain look like when we have experienced, whether it's early childhood trauma, really at any stage. So if we're just sort of haven't experienced trauma and we've had a pretty secure attachment and we're able to cope with things pretty well, our brain is generating signals about what our body needs. As opposed to if it has and you have experienced trauma, then we can't actually generate or identify our internal signals. They're all sort of mixed because the hippocampus isn't actually doing the processing that it should be doing in terms of memory. If our brain is functioning well, we can create a roadmap of the world to satisfy those needs, as opposed to creating maps that don't actually lead anywhere. We can create energy and actions to get there. So we're able to kind of mobilize ourselves to kind of say, okay, this is what I need to do, as opposed to being paralyzed to move in any direction. We're able to identify dangers and opportunities in the environment. So we're able to bring that kind of rational thought to, what's dangerous, what's safe, as opposed to being completely hypersensitive and numb to external cues, where you've got that hypervigilance, where everything feels like it's dangerous or unsafe. And we can adjust our actions based on our situational requirements. So we're able to kind of, take in our information from the environment, and we're able to sort of process that and then base our actions on it. But if we have a traumatized brain, our actions don't necessarily correspond to our needs. Okay, we're not able, that sort of functioning is a bit more challenging. We're able to coordinate and collaborate with others. I think this is a huge thing, whereas people who've had a lot of trauma, interpersonal relationships can be really challenging. And because that feeling of safety or connectivity is very, very different for somebody whose brain has been who has, had a lot of developmental trauma or a lot of trauma in their life. So does that make you thought that?
Yeah, and like I think for anyone that has had that trauma, there's not a lot of education out there as well. So they may actually know what their experience is, but not realize the physiological impact of that as well. And it's something that's really difficult to communicate to someone who has that secure, maybe attachment in their childhood, because for that person, it's so hard to comprehend. And I think that's why this session in particular is fantastic, because if you're in a professional or a personal relationship, whether it's a colleague or a friend, being able to see this from each point of view, that the person that's secure does not create any harm, or they're not minimizing because they may not understand, and vice versa. So yeah, I think that's great.
Great points, Katrina. So that's on the brain that we've just covered off. And again, as I said, there's a lot more information on that that people can kind of do some research on. The other way that trauma affects us is with our autonomic nervous system. And as a somatic therapist, this for me is, really a big area in how I educate my clients. So over here we have this diagram on the right, which really just shows you, I was really searching for the best one that I could show you on how the vagus nerve runs and the importance of this nerve in our body. So the vagus nerve runs from the back of the base of, your neck right down to your spine. It actually touches every single organ in the body. And it's one of the most important nerves that we have. We have to understand that our nervous system is all the time communicating. It's all the time, even us now chatting, my nervous system is, connecting to your nervous system. So we have to really understand the importance that it plays. And the vagus nerve, because it hits off every organ in our body, and all of the work done by Peter Levine and Stephen Porges on polyvagal theory has been absolutely critical in the development of, the ongoing kind of research that we have on trauma and understanding how it's stored in the body. So your autonomic nervous system, I like to explain it to people. People are very familiar with, the sympathetic and parasympathetic. They understand, a lot of people, biology sort of they understand biology, but they don't necessarily understand the nuances of it. And to me, it's really in the nuances of it that can really help you heal from trauma. So if you imagine we've got this big vagus nerve that hits every organ, and then it branches off into our autonomic nervous system. We've got our parasympathetic, which is responsible for our rest and digest, and we have our sympathetic, which is our more activated state. It's really important to understand then, how does trauma affect our autonomic nervous system? And our autonomic nervous system, as I said, I think in the last presentation, it is a system that operates, it's automatic, right? We don't bring a thought. It's when you are in the cinema and you're watching something terrifying, you just jump out of your seat because it's really scary. You didn't sort of stop and think, I'm going to jump at this point, or give any cognitive, it just happens. So it's your body has an automatic response to it. So it's our internal surveillance system. It's a biological resource that we all share. We all have the same biology, but it's shaped by our own experiences and patterns. And I put that in there because that's where our own experiences in life, our own childhood, everything we've experienced has started to shape our autonomic nervous system. So it's a complex system of neurons and cells, and it's always taking in sensory information. And because it's connected to all of those organs, that's why when you feel really anxious or you feel really overwhelmed, you feel it in your body, right? You feel your heart's racing, you feel nauseous, you get out of bed and you think, oh my God, or you wake up at 3 a.m. and you have a dreadful dread in your stomach, or you feel it in your body because it is affected to every organ. So I think that for people just to understand, okay, it's not just my thinking, there's something else. Yes, my brain may have had an impact from trauma, but it's not just my brain. There is also this unconscious system that is operating that we need to really bring awareness to. So this is my favorite of all of the, I'm going to talk about polyvagal theory, but I love this particular diagram, which is Natasha Wilson's, that I've actually used here. But the autonomic nervous system is, I've got a quote there from Deb Dana, but it is at the heart of our daily experience. Like, it's at the heart of our daily experience. It really dictates how we live, how we work, how we love, all of those things. And what Stephen Porges did, who is the creator of polyvagal theory, he really brought so much more science and research and information to how the vagus nerve and the vagal branch was so important for supporting regulation. So and this is one of the key resources that I always start with my clients. I always will say, okay, you're having these responses, because they will note they've got all of these symptoms. So when we start to understand, okay, these are, we want people to understand the responses and the different pathways are coming from different nervous system states, is the best way to put it. So we've got different nervous system states. So when we are in this, we call them ventral, sympathetic, and dorsal, and they're colored here in this particular chart as green and amber, and the dorsal is in the red here. But when we're in this ventral state, Katrina, that's a place of safety, right? That's a place of connection. That's a place of we call ventral regulation, where we feel at ease, our nervous systems are calm, we're happy, we're ready to engage, we're social, and we can take things in our stride, right? And problems might come up, but we're pretty much in that safe, connected space, and we're curious. And, she's done some lovely we're thriving, little diagrams there. So that's our optimum, I suppose, state, is our ventral vagal. Our sympathetic, which is our fight or flight, which people are familiar with. So our fight or flight is that's that one step down, and our fight or flight is designed to help us in survival, right? So it is a really primitive response that we have evolved to help us, and our ancestors would have had to, here's a tiger, here's a lion, we need to keep in survival mode. So our fight or flight and our sympathetic is helpful in those instances, but it's not helpful in when we're constantly in that survival mode. And people who have experienced trauma, that's how they will spend a lot of time in that fight or flight. And then the third part is the dorsal, which is at the bottom. And, the dorsal, when it's working part of our, parasympathetic, where it nourishes us, brings nutrients into our body. But when it is activated with a trauma response, it really we see it more as a total shutdown or immobilization. And we can see that where people have, they want to hide, they want to disappear, they've got no energy, it's really that absolute, they can't get off a couch, or they're really, really struggling in terms of that either freeze response. It's a real immobilization, is the best way to put it. Why this is so important is because if people can understand that, okay, I'm not saying you have to stay in ventral vagal all the time, but when you're noticing, and what we teach people is, I'll often ask people when they come and see me and they'll say, I'm not sure, but this is what I'm feeling. I'll get them to tell me, Katrina, where do you find that you spend most of your time? Where do you feel that? And somebody might say, I go to work and then I don't want to connect with people. I don't want to go out. They'll be able to recognize where they are. And, with polyvagal theory and trauma, what's helpful for, what's a really great resource is that people can understand these different nervous system states, and they can start to really tune into, with what we call neuroception, they tune into, oh, okay, it's okay to move out of ventral, but you don't want to be coming too far down the ladder. So that's what, as a therapist, that's what I teach people, is to really bring that attunement to your autonomic nervous system. And so you know that, oh, I'm coming out of this state. And, it's helpful then that they're not going to slide too far down the ladder, because we don't want people to come out of what we call their window of tolerance. So they're the nervous system states. And to me, this is probably the most, it's the most incredible work done by Stephen Porges. This is a ladder. I'm just looking at time, so I'll have to quickly go through these. But I give this ladder to my clients to get them to understand the concept of the automatic ladder, so they can see the 3 different states, and that they can use that to see whether they're in that safe social, whether mobilized, or whether they're numb. So really, really helpful. The window of tolerance, again, is another resource that I will always give to clients, to say, here's the window of tolerance. That is the place that you feel safe and connected. And then they can understand when they're overwhelmed or when their sympathetic kicks in, they go into that hyperarousal, they're anxious, they're angry, they're out of control. When they go into hypoarousal, that's that shutdown state. Neuroception is a really, really important word. We're all familiar with perception. We use cognitive perception to be able to go and see, make a judgment of, oh my God, this place doesn't feel very safe. My perception is it's not going to be safe in here, or it's not very clean, or whatever. Neuroception is a term that's really important to understand, because our nervous system is constantly doing 3 things. It is communicating inside, outside, and between. So inside, it's listening to your bodily experience, and it's sending messages up to your brain. Outside, it's taking cues from the environment all of the time. I'm looking at her face, his voice, oh, that person looks a bit threatening, or whatever it is. And the between, it listens between other nervous systems. And we can all relate to that. Somebody may come in and you may sort of think, oh my God, they're not making me feel very easy. And people who've endured a lot of trauma, they are going to react to facial cues, to voice, smell, all of those things. So we have to bring perception to neuroception, and then we make the implicit, we bring that into explicit awareness. And that's a really powerful thing then for clients to understand for healing, because if it just says implicit, it'll keep running the show in the background. So we have to do that. So now we will go on to talk a little bit about unresolved trauma. And unresolved trauma really, when we're understanding the brain, we've understood now our sort of responses. With unresolved trauma, I think the best way I would put it to people is to say, do you have reactions or responses to things that really feel disproportionate? Do your responses really feel disproportionate to whatever's occurred? And that's one of the real key questions that I would ask. We see things like perfectionism, we see people pleasing, we see this distrust of people, we see the dissociation, this constant hypervigilance. But when you take, we see it in relationships, and a good example would be somebody who may have unresolved trauma, may not trust people, may not, feel. So they could be in a relationship and, their partner forgets to send a text. And then that suddenly blows up into, something far, far bigger. The response is far bigger. So it's always around that sort of, we see it in relationships, and we see it around boundaries. We see it in fear of being abandoned. So I think a really good question there, I always say to people, is just see whether the response is, whether that response is sort of equates to what has actually come up. I'm looking at time here. My goodness.
That's okay.
I got my time. How am I? Is there any 5 minutes?
You've got another 5-10. We're not going to, this is
so
important. I don't want us
That's okay. Because with this part, so with neuroception, and why I want people just to understand this is because we have to tune in and see what is happening for us in terms of to help us sort of determine what's happening in our nervous system. And then we can see whether the response that we're having is, warrants sort of warrants the whatever has happened, or whether that big emotion is a lot. I'm going to just quickly show you these images, and just, having a look at these images. So with those images, why I put those there is really just to make a point that no two nervous systems are the same. And when you look at that blue door, people will have different responses to that. When we look at Kiko, who's my doggy, some people will think, oh my goodness, that's really cute. She looks really cute. She's lovely. Somebody else would look at that and go, my God, no, I don't like dogs. That's going to bring up a memory, right? And the beach, somebody that looks lovely and it looks really peaceful. For somebody else, that might bring up a fear of water or whatever it is. So we have to bring neuroception. And to the point about unresolved trauma, it's us being able to just pause and just to be able to really check in. Yes, is my response appropriate? Or is it bringing up sort of old feelings? Traumatic memory. Traumatic memory is another way that we can help see whether we're having unresolved trauma by the memories that we're sort of having. So with traumatic memory, it's different to normal memory in that sometimes those memories, they don't soften over time, right? So we have these memories, but they seem to really stay intense. Traumatic memories tend to be sensory, and by that I mean that you feel like that, you can still, the sound and the sight and the smell, those are the sort of, you will smell something, maybe it could be food or it could be cigarette smoke, it could be something, and that sort of evokes that sort of memory. They're very, very sensory. They're fragmented. So what we spoke about earlier, not all of the information is there. The passage of time is often distorted. So you can't really it's not as easy as other memories and putting them together. With those, what can be really, really helpful with if somebody has that and thinks that there is unresolved trauma, the memory is normally something that can give them a really good indication if they are having that sort of memory. And in work there, we do work with sort of movement, with art, with journaling, to help sort of, to piece those out in a very, very safe way. But the important thing that we say here, that I have here on the right, is in any work, or for anyone who thinks they have unresolved trauma, we have to really, really go slow. We've absolutely slow. We have to stay in our window of tolerance. That's absolutely key. You've got to recognize, that it can be, you can't compare. There has to be a lot of love, a lot of self-care, and you've got to surround yourself with people who can really, really help you in the process. But that's something that, definitely when we're looking at, is this trauma unresolved, that memory can be a real indicator of the sort of memories that people would be having. Some of the therapy that Sorry,
I was just going to say with that, Helen, someone may be tempted to just, if they're in a new relationship or a friendship and they want to share their childhood trauma with someone, they may be tempted to share all, or even be prompted because they think getting all of this off their chest, but it's actually, that's quite unsafe. Just reinforce.
Absolutely. And it can be, sometimes we have what's called trauma bonds, where people do, or they meet, and there can be, and we do see with people that they feel, oh, well, it's really, really important, what I would say, that you've really, really got to go slow, and you've really, really got to there's the two parts. We want to have an internal and an external. So as I said, it's like teaching somebody how to drive. You want to, for me as a therapist, it's that analogy of taking my 18-year-old out and giving her the keys of the car. She's going to know how to brake. And that's what we apply to trauma. You have got to know. And that's why I think, why I've approached this tonight, for people to understand the brain, understand the body, understand what it is. Because if you don't understand, and that polyvagal theory is so important, then you're kind of going into this and it's going to be too intense. Your nervous system is going to have a really, really strong response to it. So it's not something, you've got to do the external, and preferably be supported by a trauma therapist, and make sure you have all those resources. And if you don't have, and I understand not everybody can go to therapy or afford therapy, but have a really good friend or, someone that you really, really trust, that can give that sort of support and comfort. But two of the things here that I just was suggesting was, parts work, which is fantastic for IFS therapy, which I work with an awful lot, the Richard Schwartz work, because it helps you identify the part of you that's holding the burden of the trauma. So not all of you is traumatized. We're all made up of many different parts in our psyche. So that's a great way of just identifying that part and being able to really, really work with that part. Another thing that I like to do, and some of my clients do this, is if they are, you can work with sort of Margaret Wittenberg's, from her 10 questions of anxiety, which is some great questions. Here we get people to sort of write out, not type, because we always want to slow everything down. But, getting people to bring that implicit awareness to, what do you feel in your body? So you've had this response and you're thinking, is this unresolved trauma? Okay, so this is important, because I don't want to say, because you've had this response, it's unresolved trauma. Not everything is unresolved trauma. You're going to have certain responses that are not. You're just pissed off, or you're just fed up, or you're just whatever. But if you're curious that you're having this kind of response that seems much bigger than that needed to be, for you're snapping at your kids, or you're snapping at your boss, or you're feeling really insecure, or whatever it is, this is quite a nice exercise to do. Do it slowly, write it out. I do it as a journaling exercise with clients, but we really get people to tune into, okay, well, what do you feel in your body? There's 6 questions here. What do you feel in your body? Say if they've had it, if you've had this response, what's the earliest age you remember feeling those sensations? What were you doing? And seeing what sort of comes up. Can you create an image of yourself feeling these sensations? Who else might have been there? And is the current situation in any way similar? And we really then get to clarify in that process whether they're owed feelings, are they accurate for the current situation? And that can be really helpful, just for people to go, well, yes, because I'm feeling I didn't get that text from my girlfriend, and or somebody told me that they didn't listen to me in that meeting, or whatever it was, and I felt all of this. That can be quite a nice exercise just to do very slowly, not get overwhelmed with it. And but it can really help. That can help kind of with that processing of really, kind of understanding whether this is linked to some unresolved trauma. And definitely parts work. Parts work. I've just put this quote in here. There are no bad parts, only parts that have been burdened and dissociated through trauma into extreme roles. Internal family system strives for parts to become non-extreme. And we understand that there's the 3 groups. I love this. And I give people the analogy of the map of Ireland. I say, like, there's all of the counties, and imagine your inner world is like that. So there may be a part of you that is holding on to the burden and the trauma. And our work is really to identify the part, befriend the part, understand it as a protector part. And we tend to classify those parts as, that's the exile. We classify them as managers, and they're the kind of, they work really hard, the managers, they keep us on our toes day to day. They can be perfectionist parts, they work really hard. We've got the firefighter parts, that are also protector parts, but they tend to lead us into that sort of, more harmful sort of behaviors, addiction, things that really can, give us that sort of level of safety. So definitely parts work is something I recommend. I've just put a quick note in here on titration from Peter Levine, and what this is a really key thing, and Katrina, you probably have seen this with your intake work, that people get frightened by their own physical responses to trauma. And they want to avoid everything I've said tonight. They want to avoid getting in touch with their sensations because they're overwhelming. And it can be, as a trauma therapist, I can tell you, it can be really, really challenging because, you know, people will back away. They don't want to access those painful emotions. So what we do is we work in a process called titration, which is slowly, little bit by little bit, and allowing that pendulation so people can go into what we call, you know, we've got a counter vortex, to make sure that people feel, you know, safe, and help them, you know, to really help them heal. Couple of last points. These are just some points that I thought of, you know, don't recall traumatic memories if you don't have the resources to support. Like you were saying there, don't go having a chat with people who it can't be received, because that's really, really not really helpful. External resource, make sure you have grounding skills, safety processes in place, because if you're doing it in a safe environment with a trauma therapist, you're going to be able to restore those memories very differently than if you're just, you know, having a chat with someone who's not really going to be able to help you. You need to have the internal resources, as I said, put on the brakes. If you can't see a therapist, definitely is safe. Things that are comforting, things that are soothing for you. Therapy I recommend is EMDR therapy, and that's where we have bilateral eye movements, which is desensitization, which is fantastic for, I think, more for adults, for people who've had, you know, traumatic experiences more in adulthood. But we can also do things that sort of eye movements, because it's less, I find it's less effective on childhood trauma. But still it's a you know, fantastic resource for people to try if they haven't. But doing things where your eyes naturally move laterally, like hiking, and that sort of exercise is helpful. Somatic therapy, somatic experiencing, which is an area that I work in, and that's really understanding that implicit memories are stored deeper in the older parts of our body, so they're connected to our sensations, right? And those memories are stored really deep. So we want to do what's called completion work, and that's often where people, you know, the trauma gets stuck in the body. So people feel, I want to run away, I really want to run away, I feel like I need to get up and run. They've had something happen and they weren't able to get away, so they're stuck in that, they're frozen in that feedback loop. So often what we do in therapy is we help activate that, we help with movement, we help them get that sort of energy moving out of the body. I assess parts therapy, do grounding work, trauma-informed yoga, meditation. You know, meditation works for some people, doesn't for others. It has to be trauma-informed, breath work, process, you know, orienting. There's lots of different work that we can do. And lastly, some books that I recommend. These are probably four of my favorite, which is Peter Levine's Healing Trauma. Absolutely, The Body Keeps Score, which is Basil van der Kloek's work, which is groundbreaking, and I really would suggest people read who are more interested in the subject. Gabor Mate's The Myth of Normal is a fantastic read, and a lot of great information that people can take away. And we've got Peter Levine's, this was one of my earliest books in therapy, which is really will explain how trauma gets stuck in the body, and that's Waking the Tiger, which is a fantastic book. There's also that movie, The Wisdom of Trauma, that's really helpful, that I suggest people watch. And I will send Una just a list of resources of places you can contact. The Blue Knot Foundation, they've got a really good website, and I think they have a broken down in a really easy way to sort of understand trauma that could be helpful. But I'll put some other links in there. And yep, sorry, I've gone over time. I'm rushing through. It's such a big subject. So, you know, I hope that was clear. That was
so informative, and I think them resources really helped throughout. Thank you so much, Helen. I'm going to open it up now to the participants. If we have any questions, you can put it in the chat box, or you can turn your mic on and ask a question for Helen. And maybe while we wait, I've got one for you, Helen. I always have questions. So one that I'm really interested in is the intergenerational trauma. And I think especially with being from Ireland, there's so much of that. How can that unresolved childhood trauma have a knock-on effect, you know, through the different generations?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think when we understand that trauma is held in the body, you know, that's it. We come from, you know, our mother's womb, but we also come from our grandmother's womb, right? So that we are part of, you know, we have all of that in our DNA. So trauma is passed down at a cellular level. And then trauma is repeated from an intergenerational. If you don't heal trauma, you know, through no fault of your own, maybe, and not everybody has an opportunity to have trauma therapy or is given the resources, you know, you may pass that down to the next generation, because that's all you knew. That's how you were brought up. You know, if you were brought up with parents that weren't attuned to your needs, and that's the map that you were shown, you know, you may pass that, that may be how you parent. So I think that's why healing from trauma is so important, because, and I do say that to people, they will often say, you know, my God, yeah, I don't want to. I want to heal from this or these automatic reactions that I'm having, because I don't want to pass this on. So yeah, it's a huge huge thing that we need to look at, definitely.
Okay, thank you. And one last question, which is a really brilliant one, is, you know, there's so many people starting on this journey now. What advice would you give to someone who is working through their childhood trauma, but their parents do not acknowledge what the child claims to have experienced? How would you advise them to proceed?
Look, I would advise them, and that's quite common. Yeah, that's that minimizing, right? That's like, you know, I would advise them to continue on their work, not to be looking for that validation or that, because often that happens so often where it's re-traumatizing, because they come to say, this is how I felt, or I was shamed in childhood, or I was never listened to, and the defenses go up from the caregivers to say, well, we did our best, or we didn't, or that didn't happen, or whatever. So I would normally kind of work with somebody to really get them into a place where they become really empowered, that they don't need, because often that validation will often never come, or that acceptance will never come, or they will never say, well, that's, you know, that wasn't the reality. So I think you have to really be, stay in your healing, you know, do your healing and do your work. And when you are in that place of kind of empowerment, and when you have sort of settled your nervous system, then the acceptance of, well, it doesn't matter. Not saying it doesn't matter as much, that's the wrong words. It's not, you're not that valid, because that validation may never come, but you have processed it yourself. Yeah, it's a common one, Katrina. It's one I see, you know, and it re-traumatizes people, because they're told, well, it's in your head, or it didn't happen, or I was a good mother, or, you know, you don't know how hard it was, and it's thrown back on them. So I would say, no, stay on your own journey, doing your healing work. And you will come to a place where you will see that through a different lens, and no longer need that to be validated for your own healing.
Well, I think that's a brilliant place to end, and we've got some thank yous in the chat box, which I can echo. So I look forward to, we have many more sessions in our future, I'm sure, where we can continue to unpack this, but what a brilliant start.
Oh, thanks, Katrina. Sorry I went over, and I'm rushing. It's such a huge topic. They're so detailed, and it's just, there's a lot with it. So I hope that was helpful, and I put my contact details there. If anybody has any questions, or I wasn't clear on anything, just feel free to get in contact. And I can help explain things a little bit further. All right, good to see you.
Good night to everyone.
Yeah, you too. Take care. Bye.